that this is the loveliest group of cats it has ever been my privilege to attempt to herd. The presentation is called The Red Doors Will Never Close.
People today think of those days as very hard times, but the people who lived them feel quite differently. As you'll hear in their own words tonight, on the off chance that not everyone knows who all of these people are, let me introduce them from that side to this. That's Judy Brandt, Mary Miller, Barb Riskin, Bob Harvey, Don Hawkinson, Joni Hawkinson, Stephen Colmel, and Jane Gilgan, who has been the driving force behind this whole project. Now, this performance is based on interviews from the St. John's Oral History Project that began in 2013. We want to show you why St. John's lost so many members and how those who remained not only kept the church going, but led us into becoming a thriving, progressive church that is a spiritual home for about 700 members today. Jane was not part of the church back then. She'll provide information on events that the other performers mention as they tell their stories. Oh, one last thing. This is an evening of storytelling. After the performers on the stage tell their stories, we have more stories from folks in the audience, and you'll be invited to tell your own St. John stories. All yours, folks.
For about a year and a half, St. John's had no rector. We call that time the interim. Bob had been the rector. He resigned in October of 1981, and we hired Todd Smelser as rector in April of 1983. After Bob moved on, Bishop Anderson said he would give us no financial support to hire a new rector. We had to figure it out. So we used supply priests that whole time.
We asked the clergy we knew to take Sundays. We'd get some of them for 2-3 weeks in a row, and if we were really lucky, we got them for a whole month. If somebody in the parish had a relative who happened to be an ordained Episcopal priest and who wasn't busy on a particular week, we'd ask them to fill in. A lot of times it was a different priest each week. We had a member named Allison Crellin, who was a member here at St. John's, who was also an ordained Episcopal priest. She presided at some of our services.
What happened? How did St. John's find itself with no priest?
There were so many changes that time. Everybody reacted to those changes. Changes in the prayer book, changes in the liturgy, financial troubles that began in the 1960s, way before Bob became rector in 1970. For instance, in the 1960s, the youth group raised money to buy a bell for the bell tower. 2 or 3 times they gave the money to the vestry to help them meet the budget. We didn't get a bell until 1990, and then the owners of the decommissioned church it came from gave it to us. The changes were hard for some people, and others welcomed it. I remember there was almost a collective nervous breakdown when they were going to have the priest facing the congregation instead of the altar.
Moving the altar with the priest facing the people made a big difference to me. For a while I was unhappy, so unhappy because the priest back faced us. There was this chasm. It seemed lonely to me. A couple people at the 8 o'clock service that first Sunday were totally undone with this change. I was sort of wishing Bob would go further.
We moved the altar. That was big. We did it in steps. When I first came here, I celebrated with my back to the people, but I didn't want to be talking to the wall. I was supposed to be presiding at a table. I put up with that for just so long, and then I talked to the vestry about having it moved away from the back wall. The vestry decided to have a work day. and got the thing moved out. That was it.
Folk masses were another thing that some people didn't like, but most of us loved them.
I remember there was a folk mass the first Sunday. My husband John and I were here at St. John's. We joined in 1976. That was a guitar time. Bob was up front playing the guitar. One Sunday a month was the folk mass. We had just come from a church that had a strict way of doing things. And here they were up front playing guitars. We were not only using an ugly green temporary prayer book, but we were using a different songbook also.
I found the revisions of the prayer book challenging. We held experimental rites, and some people had trouble with them. So I held a series of lectures here. A lot of people didn't attend the lectures. In fact, you might say the attendance was underwhelming. I was surrounded by a lack of interest. St. Paul's at Lake of the Isles didn't put the new prayer book in place at all. So I was fighting against parishes that were doing the opposite of what I was. I thought this was the responsibility of a pastor.
Father Bill Goddard, who was the rector before Bob, introduced the experimental rites in the 1960s. It was a zebra book then. Some members of St. John's were open to the changes in the prayer book, but many weren't. They were still resistant to the changes when Bob arrived. I remember one time when Bob and another priest had a meeting about the changes. It was all very logical to me, but some people wouldn't listen. These two priests were so frustrated. There was nothing they could do about it.
Fu Bremner is a lifelong member of St. John's. This is what she said. There was a schism between the people who wanted the new prayer book and the people who didn't, over their dead body. I mean, my family was one of the worst in that. Remember? My father's sisters were maiden ladies who loved the church, loved the prayer book, and didn't care much for Holy Communion. In the 1970s, the Episcopal Church added communion to the Sunday services. Until that time, services typically were morning prayer, with communion served about once a month or less. My aunts fought that thing. They fought the prayer book. They wrote letters. They complained. They went to the bishop. They did everything they could think of. To Bob Harvey's credit, he didn't pay any attention. There were no ifs, ands, and buts about it. He did the right thing. Eventually, they kind of calmed down. He handled it quite well.
People had big trouble with the contemporary language of the Lord's Prayer. They couldn't figure out why they had to change the language that they were used to all their lives.
With the new prayer book, people got focused on the words that were gone. The these and the thous of Elizabethan English. What generally was not realized is that the theology in the new prayer book is quite different from the old. The new prayer book moved us away from a rigorous penitential theological stance that was held in the church. The new prayer book had an emphasis on dignity, inclusion, and social justice, especially in the baptismal covenant. Those were big changes. What I found and experienced here, people opened up more about their lives when they weren't being treated in the way like they were bad persons. People were in pain.
Before the changes, we were praying to ourselves individually. With the new prayer book, we were praying for a group as a whole.
Having children be part of the service, the whole service, drove some people away too. Some people didn't like that. You get those noisy kids out of here. Bob said, no, kids are welcome. Of course, he also had some of the noisiest kids.
Guilty as charged.
He had this huge family. Good thing he had his wife Kathy, who was very welcoming to everybody.
And what about the ordination of women? When was that? 1976?
Women on the altar didn't start till after the General Convention of 1976 that was held here in Minneapolis. The Episcopal Church passed a resolution for the ordination of women. Bob Harvey opened up the altar to women priests almost immediately. Women were going into the priesthood, and they were also going into the diaconate. St. John's was one of the first churches that welcomed women as priests and welcomed women and young women into the other roles that were previously opened only to the men and boys.
Allison Krellin was a parishioner, and she went to the local seminary here and got ordained. She was one of the first women that I had celebrate at the altar. I also mentored Ann Proctor, who was ordained a deacon here and went on to become a priest. She was well known nationally and internationally for her work in Christian education, which she began here at St. John's.
Well, what about Barbara Oz?
I tapped Barbara and suggested she'd make a good deacon. I certainly was proven right about that one. Barbara was a deacon at St. John's for 25 years.
Well, Barbara awoke me to the beauty of the Episcopal Church. A woman on the altar, let alone one being ordained, was unheard of in my Catholic upbringing. Barbara was a magnificent preacher, and she's oftentimes preaches around the state, and I fall out to hear her. I'm kind of a Barbara Mirage groupie.
I'd like to put this on record. When I started listening to some women preach, it became clear to me that women's voices are needed in the pulpit. As much as I believe I'm a compassionate person, I don't think or operate like a woman.
There was a male priest who walked out of the church when he saw a woman priest on the altar. He couldn't handle it. He left.
Vicki Madsen is a long-term member, and she said in her oral history, things opened up for women and girls at St. John's during Bob's time. When my daughter was about 13 or 14, she was one of the first 2 girls to become an acolyte.
It was at the same 1976 convention that we adopted the new prayer book. General Convention also finally made it possible for women to serve as wardens in the church. So I asked Ann Brinley, one of the long-term women parishioners, if she would serve in that role. So we were one of the first parishes in town to have a woman as a senior warden. Ann was a bit differential to men and to me, and so I helped her get over that.
I remember you said many times, what do you think? It wasn't just to Ann Brinley, but to many of us, women and men. You really wanted us to think for ourselves.
Hey Bob, how about the time a parishioner came to you troubled because she didn't believe in the virgin birth? You said,
I don't either.
Bob, I'd like to remind you of when you gave communion the first time to children. I remember you saying, I thought God was going to strike me down. When you gave communion to the children, that was unheard of.
Bob, would you tell the story that's so touching about Carolyn Crandall? She's Boo Bremner's and Ed Crandall's mother.
Carol and Crandall came into my office when I started giving communion to children before it was okay to do that. She was quite upset about it, and we had a one-on-one in my office. She left not totally satisfied. Well then, when we were at family camp at Cass Lake, I'd have everybody standing in a semicircle around the altar and have them give communion to each other. Anyway, Carolyn was beside a little boy named David. He was 4 or 5 years old.
I was sure he wasn't going to take it from him.
No, she got down on her knees. I'll never forget that. I almost started to cry. She received communion from him, and I never heard a word from her after that. Bless her heart. That's how we break through changes. Sometimes it's just by doing them.
And as I said before, we joined in 1976. At that time, the women priest thing had driven some people already away. The new prayer book had driven other people away. The other thing that drove people away was Bob getting sober. Bob decided in roughly 1972 he was an alcoholic, and he went into treatment.
When Bob got sober, it was almost like he was a turncoat. What do you mean alcohol is a problem? What are you talking about? Alcohol is a problem? We stopped inviting Bob to parish parties because we always served alcohol, and all of a sudden, he wasn't any fun.
The choir parties were notorious for drinking.
Maybe that's why we have such a small choir now.
When Bob completed treatment, he recognized there was a significant drinking problem at St. John's. And I've told this story before also. On our first Sunday at St. John's, it was during Lent. Several people had greeted us on that Sunday when we first came, very welcoming kind of parish, and they invited us to come to the Lenten Wednesday potluck, which we did. What should we bring? Oh, let's bring a bottle of wine. And we did. We brought a bottle of wine and we opened it, set it down. My husband John had a glass. At the end of the evening, the bottle of wine was still there with only one glass gone from it. And we thought, what have we come to? The first step that Bob pioneered had upset a lot of people. And a large proportion of the people who were really upset by the focus on alcoholism had already left.
A lot of people today don't realize it, but the passing of the peace caused controversy when it was first introduced. And also, we were one of the first Episcopal churches to welcome lesbian and gay people.
Russ Bremner said in his oral history that the passing of the peace changed in the 1970s. We used to say, and also with you, after the priest said, "May the peace of the Lord be with you." Then, with the change, we started doing the exchange of peace with each other. People were climbing over the pews and jumping on each other. And guitar music, and romp 'em, stomp 'em, that kind of thing. Some people didn't like that.
Well, I don't know if it was quite like that, but I do remember the new peace of the 70s. John and I used to pick up an older woman who was a member here and lived on Lindale. She was not happy about the changes. So, with the new peace, when we all stood up and greeted each other and were talking and hugging, she remained seated and said, "Well, just let me know when this tea party is over." I'm quite sure other people had stopped coming for that reason also. The church had become much more we-centered. It wasn't quite solitary worship anymore. And that new peace drove some people away.
Who said, and I quote her, "We were a very sedate Anglican church, you know. We used to have to wear little hats." Vicki Madsen said, St. John's was conservative. Yes, we had to wear hats, and then we moved into the doily. Several other people talked about the teas with the silver tea services that we held at St. John's. The women who served tea wore white gloves. You know, things changed an awful lot in the 70s and 80s. You know, what caused those changes?
Well, it started in the 1960s when Bill Goddard, the rector before Bob, visited many young families in the neighborhood and invited them to join St. John's. And we were all about the same age, in our early 20s and just out of college. 10 couples did join, and we were a driving force for change, some of which are still here, and a couple are here on the stage.
We don't know how many people left because of St. John's faithfulness to inclusion, but Carol Lynch, who's here tonight, a long-term member, said that some people left because they were anti-gay. She told the story of a World War II veteran who had been a senior warden and who, she said, was adamant against gay people, and he was vocal about it. He left the church over inclusion issues.
We were one of the first parishes to host the monthly communions for the group called Integrity. That was an Episcopal group that started in the 1970s for lesbians and gays. There was a Twin Cities chapter of Integrity.
They met at St. John for quite a while and had services in the chapel. We had a gay priest named Bob Statford who did the service with Integrity and worked with the gay members of the church. Integrity was around for quite a while and it was very welcome to it.
I had one person come and complain to me about Integrity meeting here. I talked to him about it, and he did come to understand my point of view about allowing this to happen. I didn't try to change his mind about how he felt about gay people. I never heard any more complaints from him after we talked. I was very public about it. The rector from a parish here in town, who will remain nameless, called me and threatened to placard our parish for doing that. To me, and to many people at St. John's, we were living the revised baptismal covenant, to seek Christ in all persons, to love your neighbor as yourself, and to respect the dignity of all human beings.
St. John's was losing money and members starting in the mid-1960s. The National Episcopal Church has declined in numbers from a high of 3.6 million members in the mid-1960s to about 1.8 million today. Despite the drop in numbers and financial challenges, members of St. John's made decisions and engaged in activities that have influenced the church to this day. Judy and Jim Brandt joined during that time. And Judy said,
The energy and the joy of the church was so exceptional that all I wanted to do was to be a church.
St. John's was a happy, happy place. Even with all the changes, we were happy.
But there are lots of young people in this neighborhood that had problems with drugs and alcohol during that period. The kids' drug problem started us on the path to form the first step. That's when we had neighborhood and congregational kids die. We had things stolen from the church from time to time.
The silver chalices and patens were stolen from the church, probably kids on drugs. One of the chalices was given to us in 1906. Thankfully, we got them back. They could have been melted down.
We responded to a drugs and alcohol problem. We did something about it. We tried to take care of the neighborhood, we tried to take care of ourselves, and some of us felt we did very, very well. We took care of the church. When I hear people say we are going to close the doors, that makes me very, very angry.
There was never a thought that we were going to go out of business.
We must never close the doors. Oh, no.
We were never going to close the doors.
No, we were not.
Never.
Roy Kitson, who was a pillar of the church at that time, said, "The red doors are going to stay open."
Well, I can talk about the 70s. My husband Jim and I came to St. John's during the 70s. Bob Harvey was the rector. It was a small church. I bet it wasn't any more than 80 people at the time. I thought this was a miracle church. I couldn't believe it. The energy and the joy that was in this church was so unbelievable to me that I wanted to be at church all the time. The thing I marveled at, though, and was so important, was that the people were in charge. Not the priest, and certainly not the pope. My family used the First Step program well. Jim and I went to talk to Barb Harvey one night about our son, who was having trouble with alcohol. And he wisely said to me, "Well, what about your drinking?" Ooh, shudder. My husband and I went through treatment. It couldn't have been better for us. It saved our life. On the other hand, there were people who left because of the treatment program. It was a divisive time. Cursillo was also an important time. It was an important movement at that time. It was a spiritual renewal program, as we mentioned before. It helped people understand in a new way the teachings and the ways of Jesus. It brought a deeper sense of community to many of us at St. John's. The program had rules, though, that required that couples go to Cursillo, husband and wives, for a weekend experience of renewal. Many wives did not want to go, and many husbands did not want to go. It caused divisiveness in families. Cursillo was a weekend experience, and afterwards, when we came back, we would have dinners on once a month to get together and to talk about Cursillo and share the experiences. People felt left out. If you hadn't gone to Cursillo, you couldn't go to the events. You couldn't attend the dinners. I really felt badly about that exclusivity sense. None of us meant to make that happen.
Our Wednesday morning women's group grew out of Cursillo. We started meeting in 1978. That's almost 40 years, and we are still meeting.
I'm part of the men's group that has met since the early 80s that grew out of Cursillo. We meet here at St. John's every Saturday morning at 8 o'clock. We are open to all other comers. The core group is Cursillo, but we are open to everyone.
Cursillo has been both a uniting and a dividing point.
But out of Cursillo and other factors, we started going to Cass Lake Camp for 1 week every summer as a parish. We would have 55 to 60 people there. We went to Cass Lake for 2 summers, and then we went to Camp Lawton in Western Wisconsin for the following 2 Sundays. And we built community at those camp sessions, and that would start out with Cursillo. And we thought we'd like to have family camping experiences, and we did. Camp brought a lot of people together. We had 55 to 60 people per week. We cooked together, we sang and talked around the campfire. We swam, we sailed, we canoed. Vicky Madsen organized skits for the kids, and we had a waterfront director at each period. They were wonderful weeks, to bring us together.
Hey, do you remember Super Saturdays? They were wonderful. They were a lot of fun. It was for the kids, primarily. They happened once a month. I didn't have any kids at the time, but I came anyway to help. I was very amiable. Many of the parents participated. It was a wonderful thing because it brought us together.
We started Saturday school because I came to believe that kids were not learning much when they had Sunday school for only an hour a week. At Saturday school, they met for 4 hours and learned Bible studies, put on plays, did a lot of singing, celebrated the Eucharist, and had lunch.
The lay leaders, who were primary parents, wrote the curriculum. And there were, on the average, 117 children on Saturdays once a month.
Bob Harvey resigned as rector in October 1981 to become the full-time director of the First Step. When Bob resigned, St. John's did not have the money to have a full-time rector. So the church had no rector for 18 months until we hired Todd Smelser in April 1983.
I'm trying to think who was in the leadership position at the time. To their credit, the leaders held St. John's together and supported it financially. Don Hawkinson, Steve Bougie, Barb Moraz as deacon, took on pastoral duties. Pat and Henry Lemire, Audrey Saxton, Don Barber, and the many women who did so much behind the scenes to make the church a welcoming space.
Ann and Dan Gifford, Ross Bremner, and Jaime Anderson, who was church secretary at the time. Boo Bremner ran the Fellowship Commission and did a great job of keeping a sense of community going during the interim of 1982. We had all kinds of events, like ski weekends, the May event, horseback riding, picnics, canoeing, camping, harvest home dinner, and a New Year's Eve party at the church.
Boo Bremner was chair of the Fellowship Committee during 1982, and she wrote in her annual report, "We had a wonderful time. May the spirit of fellowship continue."
Amen.
It was a very satisfying and rewarding year in many ways, but in other ways it was a difficult year without a rector or interim priest. The older people in the parish were distressed during the time that we had no priest, because who was going to bury them? Who was going to be with them in their last days? Who was going to minister to them? It was a source of deep concern to lots of us.
The bishop wanted to close the parish 2 times. Did I get that right?
Not necessarily. Back in the 1970s, Bishop Anderson was making his annual visits to St. John's. He met with a few of us after service and commented that there were 3 Episcopal churches nearby. St. Paul's by the lake, Lake of the Isles, St. Luke's across, Lake Harriet, and St. John's, who's sitting here on a main thoroughfare. We were the smallest one at that point. We talked about merging, closing, that sort of thing. Nothing came of the conversation. I don't think anyone listened or paid much attention to it. The second time was after Bob Harvey moved on in 1981. Bishop Anderson sent out a priest to meet with the vestry and other interested parties shortly after Bob resigned. In essence, this priest said the diocese would give us no help whatsoever during the interim. No supply of clergy. No support for the search of a new rector. That was the word from on high. We took that fine, no particular problem. The senior warden resigned. She didn't want to do what would be involved. I happened to be at the meeting, and I said, I'll be senior warden. I was serious. I took it over. I had 2 junior wardens. I had Steve Bougie and Audrey Saxton. Steve made sure we had priests on Sundays for the services, and Audrey took care of the activities in the social part. And additionally, he took care of the communication between St. John's and diocese. Pat Lemire was the treasurer, and she watched every penny.
So what did you all do?
Well, my thought at the time was to increase social life as much as we could possibly do, because St. John meant a lot to people who were here. We did a lot of things socially. You should have heard about some of them when people talked about Boo's annual report for the Fellowship Commission.
During the time there was no rector, there was very little money, right? I mean, did I get that right? There wasn't a lot of money and there was no rector.
Well, a lot of money is a hard term to define, but nevertheless, we made our annual contribution to the diocese through that period. We supported the diocese.
No help from the, did you get that?
We got no help from the diocese. We did it the St. John's way. Everyone pitched in.
There was money. The money got collected. The bills got paid. Simple as that. There were 2 inheritances helped a lot. Then we had a very generous couple who wiped out the mortgage. We worked at welcoming new members and increasing amounts of each and every pledge.
The annual reports during the interim showed that members of St. John's increased their pledges, and we did pay our bills. For example, in 1982, St. John's paid a diocesan pledge of $4,000 and a mortgage payment of more than $5,000. Pledges increased 25%. We paid off the mortgage in March of 1983, a month before we hired Todd Smeltzer as rector.
Ann Gifford, who is here tonight, said, "My impression was, and it still is my impression, that there was such strong leadership among the congregation. That's what's been the driving force in this community. I admire it." Ann continued, "When we started at St. John's, it was before Todd arrived in 1983. You guys were running things. We didn't have a priest, right? It was amazing. Everything worked."
So Ann and many others were amazed that this was a parish without a permanent priest.
But aren't we all priests?
Yes.
Well, yes, the people up here and say certainly thank the 2 of you very, very much. We've done a lot of work on this exchange. We've been doing this for a couple of years. We dealt with 10 headstrong individuals up here who wanted to write the script in their own way.
They did. You did.
Well, we got a few words in. Not very many. But thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.